Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined by religion reporter Tamara Kemsley. Hello, Tamara.
Hey, Dave.
We remind you, our listeners, about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all of our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now for today's show. At every spring general conference, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints offers a glimpse of its growth by reporting worldwide membership statistics, including the number of converts and children added to the faith's rolls the previous year. A more reliable barometer for tracking church expansion, however, can be found in the congregations created or subtracted. So when the governing First Presidency recently announced new requirements for establishing wards and stakes or clusters of congregations, insiders and outsiders naturally wondered what impact the changes would have. For instance, stakes in most of the world previously needed 1,900 members. Now they need 2,000 or 5% more. While stakes in the U.S. and Canada also need 2,000, but that's 33% fewer than the previous 3,000. On its face, this appeared to make it easier to form new stakes and, in essence, inflate the church's congregational count. But experts say that may not be the case. In fact, Matt Martinick, an independent researcher who tracks church movements for the websites Camor.com and LDS Church Growth.blogspot.com, argues the overall rules will result in fewer stakes and wards coming online. He joins us today via Zoom to discuss the recent changes and other trends in church membership, including a newly released study showing self-identifying Latter-day Saints make up 42% of Utah's adult population. Matt, welcome back to Mormon Land.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dave.
So, Matt, explain for our listeners what the new requirements are for wards and stakes.
Yeah, sure. So the church has had requirements for creating new congregations, which in the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, that would be wards and branches, and also requirements to create stakes, which is how wards are organized into hierarchical units. Now, these changes don't affect branches being created in terms of those requirements. It just has to do with wards and stakes, and also with stakes based on the information released by the church. And so previously, like you had mentioned in the introduction there were different requirements for stakes and wards to be organized. Previously, there were different requirements based on geography inside the United States and Canada or North America and outside of the United States and North America. With these changes, this announcement that goes into effect as of January 1st, there will now be a uniform standard for minimum requirements to create new wards and stakes. And so now what that will be is 150 active full tithe-paying Melchizedek priesthood holders capable of serving in leadership positions. Previously, it was 120 for other countries and 180 for the United States and Canada. Membership now is just going to be 2,000, regardless of what country the stake would be organized in. Previously, it was 3,000 for the U.S. and Canada and 1,900 for other countries. Participating adults, this is a new metric required for creating new stakes and wards. And for a stake, it's 500 adults that are participating adults, and youth is 100, but not required for the youth. It's recommended that many. In terms of what's defined as a participating adult, that would be adults that are participating in church regularly. They pay a full tithe, hold a temple recommend, hold a calling, enrolled for seminary for youth. So these are some fairly strict guidelines for being considered a participating adult. And so that's what they are for stakes. Now for the wards, previously it was 250, or previously it was 300 for the United States and Canada in terms of total membership required to create a new ward, 150 for other countries. Now it's going to be 250 to create a ward. And then also the requirement for the number of active full tithe paying Melchizedek priesthood holders capable of serving in leadership positions will be 20 for all areas where wards are created. Before it was 20 for the U.S. and Canada and 15 for other countries. Participating adults is 100 now, and participating youth is 20. It's recommended for creating a new ward. So I know that's a lot of information. That would be kind of hard to digest just hearing that information. So it might be good to visually to look at that and read about it to make sense of it. But that's pretty much what the updates were, Dave.
Right. And we have stories on that, of course, on our website. So let's cut to the chase about what the impacts could be. What effect do you believe the new rules will have on congregation growth in the U.S. and Canada?
Yeah, great question. So, in terms of congregational growth, the United States and Canada has been really quite consistent for decades. So the number of new wards and branches created in the United States has, like I said, been fairly constant over time. It definitely goes up and down. In 2022, we had a really low year where there was, if I remember correctly, I believe there's actually a decline in number of congregations that year. But typically we see a steady increase in those units. And usually it's about 100 or so net increase in ward and branches in the U.S. In Canada, that number tends to not move that much. It reached about 500 a few years ago, and it's gone down a little bit to like 490-ish or so. Might be more like 480 now. So fairly stagnant for congregational growth in Canada.
How might they affect such growth in the rest of the world? So if we're looking beyond U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, and actually I just realized I kind of summarized what growth trends have been like for congregational growth in the U.S. and Canada, but not describing how these new standards would impact that. So I do think it's going to make it easier for the church, of course, to organize new wards in terms of raw membership, right? So that's going to make it a little easier. I mean, it's only 50 members less, not huge number, just on the rolls, but might make it more difficult in terms of participating adults. So these aren't just adults that go to church regularly. I mean, these are ones that have a calling, that pay a full tithe, have a temple recommend. I mean, those are pretty significant requirements, and that'll likely result in a decrease in the creation of new wards in the United States and Canada in the coming years, just because it might be more difficult for some of these congregations that are growing quite large to have enough participating members to create new units. Now, of course, the biggest change is with the membership requirements for creating new stakes in the U.S. and Canada. I mean, that's 33% fewer members needed. But again, this is for creating new stakes. It's not about looking at all these stakes that are already around that aren't necessarily that large and then redistricting everything and gerrymandering tons of new stakes. I don't think that's a very likely scenario, just because of a variety of reasons in terms of not being very efficient with using meeting house space and so forth. But also, I mean, you have to have 500 participating adults to create a new stake. And again, that's a pretty high number. I mean, that equates to at least 5 wards worth of participating adults. And that might make it more challenging. It might delay the creation of new wards and new stakes when in the past that might have been able to be reached more easily. But going to your question there about internationally, we'll see likely a significant decrease in the number of new stakes and wards being created internationally, just because with a lot of these, like, for example, especially with districts. So districts are these organizational units in the church that comprise several branches. Usually there's at least 3, sometimes there's as few as 2. But there might be as many as 13, 14, 15 branches in some of the larger districts. And these districts are overseen by a mission president. They do not have wards in them. And there is a lot of variability in terms of how many congregations are in them, like I just explained, and also how many active members there are, too. You can have districts that have, you have 3 branches, each with 20 active members, and that's a district. Kind of more of an extreme example of a smaller district, but you can have some districts that have thousands of participating members that have that are not organized into a stake yet. And so these districts can progress into stakes, but these requirements will make it much more challenging for these districts that have been getting close to becoming stakes to become stakes. And so I could see this especially affecting areas like the Philippines, where there are a lot of districts in the church still, where there's approximately 4 dozen districts where we've seen districts regularly advancing into stakes. We've just had 2 that became stakes in the last month or 2. So I think that we would probably see a delay in some stakes being organized, or perhaps maybe never being organized potentially if they're not able to reach these minimum criteria to be organized as stakes. So I do think we would see quite a decrease, like I said, in the rate of these new stakes and new wards being organized. I also see that it's going to be much more common probably for stakes to create more branches instead of wards now, and then hoping that these branches can become large enough to become wards, or maybe just focusing more on smaller congregations of branches instead as a way to bypass some of these more stringent qualifications. So I think those are some of the likely scenarios there. Another thing I want to mention as well with this is, in terms of if the church is going to apply these standards to currently operating stakes and wards, I think that's unlikely, just because, for one, a lot of these units do function quite well, even if they maybe are below some of these criteria here. I think really the purpose here is to prevent the creation of wards and stakes just for the sake of it, without any sort of growth to support that.
Big growth, in parts of Africa. And I'm thinking, how these changes could affect places like, say, the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah, I don't think these criteria will make much of a difference in creating new stakes and wards in places like the DR Congo. And the reason why is because these countries, they already well exceed oftentimes these standards to organize new wards and stakes. And like I'd mentioned, with districts, sometimes they have many more active participating members than stakes do in other countries. The DR Congo is definitely a country like that, where it's quite common to have, 80-90% of church reported membership that are attending church regularly. So, it might result in perhaps fewer wards being organized. But in terms of stakes, that's just 1,000 members more. It's 30 more active full tie-paying Melchizedek priesthood holders that are capable of serving in leadership positions. So I don't think that it would probably affect growth too much before and after these new standards have gone into effect. But I certainly see this affecting other areas of the world much more significantly. And like I'd mentioned, the Philippines, but Latin America, I think, is another place where we have some of these districts that have been teetering on becoming stakes. And unfortunately, I think this is going to be quite a disappointment for some of them, because, this is going to make it much more difficult to attain that with higher standards, but it'll also result in creating stakes that are much more resilient in the long term, though.
Are you a fan of the changes? Can you think of maybe a reason why they were put in place?
Yeah, I do think that overall, Tamara, I would say I am a fan of these new requirements. I really like one of the things I really like about these requirements is the lower standard for membership in the United States, just because we have many places in the United States where the church functions much more like it would in Europe, or in industrialized East Asia than it would in Utah, and so standards like these will make it much more likely, like for the Traverse City, Michigan district to finally become a state. Just because these districts, they tend to have not very many members. There's only a couple left, by the way, in the United States of districts, but that's the only one that really seems likely to become a stake in the foreseeable future. But you also have many stakes that cover large geographical areas in the plain states and in the Northeast. And this can allow for creating stakes that are not as large geographically and place less of a burden on stake leadership to visit and to work with the members and leaders in these areas within the stake. So I think that it's a very positive one. It also is great too, in my opinion, because it really takes down this barrier or this distinction between the church in the United States and Canada versus everywhere else. Like, the church should be the same everywhere in terms of how it's administered in a lot of ways. And so this really helps to, take that away and really make it just more uniform across geographical boundaries.
So, Matt, a number of the observers have noticed that the requirements, at least as spelled out in the church's new news release, say nothing, at least explicitly, about women or the Relief Society. Should those numbers be part of the equation? I mean, we talked about participating adults, but should those be taken into account?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Dave. And My response to that initially, I mean, I'm just processing that question you asked right now, but my initial response to that is that has not been a problem the church has had in terms of participating women. And so I think the reason why these standards have been updated is that really across the world, one of the biggest challenges the church has had has been finding these participating men that are able to serve in these leadership positions that women cannot serve in. And so I think that's the reason why women are not mentioned, is because of, in terms of the leadership side, just because in most places that has not been an issue or a challenge that the church has had to staff that have made stakes and boards functional. Whereas it's been more on the Melchizedek priesthood side, where that's been more of a barrier that has prevented growth and more self-sustainability with congregations.
Let me ask one other question along that line, though. What messaging, though, does it send by not mentioning women or Relief Society? Does it mean that you could technically have a ward without women? Technically.
Yeah, I think that would mean that, technically, Dave. I can't think of any examples of where that's happened. There are branches that are almost entirely made up of men, and there are branches that are almost entirely made up of women, and that's not just in a correctional facility setting. That includes branches in isolated areas that are for example, there's a branch in Mongolia that is in a mine that is for a mining complex. And I believe that branch is probably entirely made up of men. And then also you have branches that are almost entirely made up of women, especially in Hong Kong. There's branches there where, these are, housekeepers and doing those type of jobs in there from other countries, a lot of times from the Philippines. And so, but in terms of wards, I don't think I have encountered that. Not to say it hasn't happened, but I think theoretically that's a possibility. But I think the point to bring back to this, Dave, as well with that question is that this has never been a requirement, though, either with the old standards or the new ones in terms of Relief Society leadership. And I think one of the reasons for that as well, too, is that if you think of callings like clerks are, unless there's some example or exception that I'm not aware of, those are all staffed by men that are Melchizedek priesthood holders. And you see that also with, of course, with the bishopric, and you see that with, stake high council and patriarchs. And so I think just based on how the church is organized in terms of it being with those priesthood offices, that's why it's really essential that there is enough men to fill those positions. Otherwise, the church can't function as a stake or as a ward.
Let's talk about the new study, which made headlines saying that self-identifying Latter-day Saints make up 42%, which is a pretty significant, departure from half, far less than half, you could say, of Utah's population. What did you think of that finding?
I was totally not surprised. That really conforms with what we've known about with member activity rates in Utah for decades. And, that is in line in terms of what the church reports in terms of membership, but taking into account that not all church members on the records identify as Latter-day Saints. And so that was not surprising. And it was a fantastic study to be able to really underscore the difference between self-affiliation and church-reported membership. Typically, we've gotten these type of figures from government censuses, which present some of their own limitations and challenges. And so this was a great piece of original research that really solidifies that, that's where things are at in terms of self-identified Latter-day Saints in Utah.
So what do you think, kind of pivoting that off of that, most observers, including researchers, get wrong about Latter-day Saint membership in Utah?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of things. So one of them is I think people think that Utah is this, homogenous. It's just everyone is Mormon. There's this. I mean, that's not really a thing I think people in Utah believe or think. But outside of Utah, it's seen as that, and it's just not correct. It's never been correct. If you go back to 1920, only 60% of the population in the state of Utah was on the church records. That's lower than it is now. So, and it's ebbed and flowed a little bit over time, but roughly speaking, in the last century, it's really been about 2/3 of the state population have been on the church's records as members. And in terms of the activity rate in Utah, I mean, that's typically been about 50% overall for quite some time, at least the last few decades. And so if you take, approximately 2/3 of the state population is a member of the church, is Latter-day Saint, and you take half of that, that's 33%. That's lower than the number that's reported in the Craig and Bull and Phillips study, which was 42%. So the thing that was really neat with this study is that then we're able to get an idea of, okay, what are the number of people in Utah that do not appear to attend church really at all or have any measurements of activity in the church? How many of those people still identify as a Latter-day Saints? And so that comes out to about 10% of the population of Utah would be in that category of an inactive person, an inactive member on the records, but still identifies as a Latter-day Saint. And so that's really interesting and very informative. It also shows that 22% of the state population are people who are on the church records but do not consider themselves Latter-day Saints. So that's a pretty big amount, right? 22%, that's 1/3 of church membership in Utah. And that's a little over 1/5 of the total state population, which is also, I think, very informative. The part that I think is more difficult to determine here with this is how has self-affiliation in Utah changed over time? And of course, the authors, they reference a very well-known study that was done looking at national rates of religious affiliation. That's with the American Religious Identification Study. And that found that in 2001, 53% of the state of Utah were identified as Mormon. And so that, again, that's just barely over 50%. And that was over 20 years ago. And so I think that, really shows that, that's just really practically half, right? And of course, the Cragen study that I just mentioned, the Cragen, Bull, and Phillips study, I mean, that's a little lower than that, right? It's 42%. And the authors in their paper assume a linear decrease during that past 20 years or so, which I think is likely accurate. I wonder what that would look like in terms of self-affiliation over time. I would imagine that's probably gone down over time, just based on some of the factors the authors mentioned in the article in terms of secularization. Probably less likely to have people who do not attend church or do much of anything that would define them as a Latter-day Saint, and they still call themselves a Latter-day Saint. I think that's much less common now than it was 20, 30, or 40 years ago. But the activity piece, that's a part that I'm a bit hung up on and saying, I don't think that really Utah has perhaps ever really been a majority Mormon or Latter-day Saint state, just because if you take the activity rate into account, and if we had more data actually having studies like this one that was just done 20, 30, 40 years ago, which I'm not aware of there being any on a scale of thousands of subjects in the study, it may have been similar to that back then where, if we were to assume the rates of self-affiliation, what they are now, and impose that on the past 4 decades, then perhaps there's only a few years from 1987 to 1993 where Latter-day Saints that self-identified were a little bit over 50%. So I think it raises a lot of interesting questions. And like I said, I think it's been a great piece of research that's been done that really helps to confirm kind of a lot of what we've been suspecting and already kind of known about what things look like in Utah in terms of the religious, just what that looks like in terms of that religious landscape.
Matt, you wrote an interesting blog on this at LDSChurchGrowth.blogspot.com. And this week, and any listeners interested in this topic, I'd urge them to go read that. I want to drill down a little bit more on this, if that's okay, because you make an important point. There's a difference because people are always wondering, okay, but how many Latter-day Saints are active? You hear this a lot whenever the church reports its membership statistics. Yeah, you have people who are self-identifying. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're active, of course. So it's a clue, right? I mean, it sort of goes along that line. But what can you learn about? Like you talked about the difference between people who are self-identifying and people who are active or inactive or whatever. Is there information for the church in that could maybe be helpful as they seek to retain members or whatever?
Yeah, and I think the church really has a lot of good information about this. As a researcher who's been interested in looking into this area for decades and never having lived in Utah myself, I get a little bit frustrated that there's such an emphasis on Utah being the church when it's not. I mean, there's, of course, I think important reasons why people are interested in it, because that's where church headquarters are. That's where, the church, really has its, a lot of its kind of headquarters of operations based out of. But I think in terms of looking at how this is useful information, I think one thing, there's been a lot of information that you see on social media where people make it sound like the church is just falling apart. And that's just not true. If you look at the data, that does not support that in any way, shape, or form. And this study itself is evidence of that when you have 2/3 of church membership still referring themselves as a Latter-day Saint in 2022. At a time when we've seen much more secularization of the state population. If it was a bigger issue, it would have been much lower than that. And then furthermore, the rate of stakes and wards and branches being created in Utah has been so consistent for the past 20 years at about 400 members per ward or branch in Utah. And that hasn't really changed much. It's been very constant. And it might change in the future. We don't know. But at least looking to where we are now to where we were 20 years ago, it's actually been a fairly positive trend in terms of growth in Utah. And in the blog post you mentioned, Dave, I really outline and go through a lot of that and explain how that's the case. But the population of the state in Utah is growing at a much more rapid rate than the Latter-day Saint membership reported by the church is growing. In the last, let's see here, I think it was between 1990 and 2022, the state population in Utah grew by about 96%. So nearly doubled during that time, whereas church membership grew by 66.6%. And so about 2/3 larger in 2022 versus 1989. So, that is quite an increase for both of those. Although, again, the general population is growing at a more rapid rate. And so I think what this shows, Dave, in terms of your question here is, I think this explains why we've seen such an increase in missions being created in Utah. So, just to think back, if you look back at 1987, there were only 2 missions in Utah. That's it for the whole state. And next year, now we're in 2024. So this year in July, there's going to be 13 missions in Utah. So that's a pretty massive increase in missions, especially for a state that only comprises 1% of the national population. So, there are going to be 120 missions in the United States as of July 2024, if everything goes as planned. And that is going to mean that out of all those missions the church has in the United States, almost 11% of those are going to be in Utah, a state with only 1% of the population. And this is a finding we see in the church internationally as well. The church organizes missions primarily based on where the members live, not primarily based on the populations targeted by missionaries. And there's pros and cons to this approach. One of the big cons of it is that you're using resources in an area of members where the members might be able to do a lot of that work themselves, and that you're not addressing or targeting these more densely populated areas with a very small or non-existent church presence. On the flip side, the positive with that, though, is you have the infrastructure there to accommodate that missionary force and to help fellowship new converts. So there's pros and cons to this approach with how the church has organized missions in the last several decades. But really, I think with Utah, with this percent of people who are not identifying with Latter-day Saint, who are not active members going up and up, that is providing some more opportunities for missionary work. And I think that's one of the big reasons why we're seeing so many more missions being created in Utah, even though, people think of Utah as this stereotypically, Mormon homeland, motherland kind of place or something.
So I'm going to ask you a question, because I know you've talked about this before, but where do you peg the activity rate in the church around the world? Not everywhere in the world, but just overall.
I would say approximately 40%. Actually, I'm sorry, that would be for the United States. 40% for the United States. For the world as a whole, I would say about 30%. And the reason why it's that low is because the countries with the most members outside the United States have also some of the lowest activity rates in the church. And so you look at Mexico, Brazil, Philippines, Peru, Chile, Argentina, those countries are all in the top, 10 countries with the most Latter-day Saints on church records. And they have some of the lowest activity rates. And so those countries really drag that down. But even if we look at countries with fewer members, depending on world region, some countries, it's only, 8 to 12% of the record members on the records are considered active members. But you have other extreme on the other side in some areas in Africa and some other countries where it is, over 80%, but those are definitely the exception to the norm.
So then what about these new rules? How do you see them impacting? I know we're coming back to Utah again, but how do you see them impacting congregational growth in Utah?
Great question. So I think that in Utah, so a lot of church growth in Utah is like musical chairs. It's people moving around. It's not necessarily from you having a bunch of people join the church, although the missions in Utah tend to be some among the most productive in terms of baptisms. But I think what we could see at these new standards is that we could see more wards being created in new neighborhoods and housing communities that are being developed. And so if we track where the wards and branches are being created in Utah, mainly more of the wards being created in Utah, they're in new housing development areas. So especially like in Utah County, like if I were to name a few examples, it'd be like in Eagle Mountain, Saratoga Springs, Lehigh. In southern Utah County, that would be like in Mapleton, some areas of Spanish Fork, Payson, all in that area. And then in St. George, a lot of in the southern areas of the city there. Those are some areas that tend to have a fair amount of growth, as well as some areas in the Cache Valley. So, in those places, we might see more wards being created than in the past based on these standards and also stakes, perhaps. But that would assume that these areas are having the requisite activity rates in terms of this participating member part to where they could create more wards. And so it might not be a difference actually because of that. I think it just depends on what is the activity rate of these members moving to these places. Now, in terms of if stakes are being discontinued, I don't see probably a change in that. My understanding is that a lot of times when a stake is discontinued or a ward is discontinued, a lot of times there's been really efforts for months or years to try to see if things can be reversed, or, there's planning that goes into effect that can take a long time. And eventually that happens. It's because it's just not able to provide a very uplifting and supportive environment for the members that are left in that area if it's just so minimally staffed with not very many participating members, especially for youth. And so I think that's interesting with these new standards. We have this youth component to it as well. And so that's going to make it, might make some changes to that as well.
Matt Martinick, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Happy New Year.
Yes. Happy New Year for you as well.
And thanks to Tamara Kemsley.
Thanks so much, you guys.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind you to keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.